the profession as a whole is shocked. Shocked that this occurred. That doesn't mean that the leaders of these firms are going to concede, but they're shocked. And the second part is this is the equivalent of dealing with respect, the Godfather. This is like you're giving in to an extortionate threat.
I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and this is Justice by Design, a podcast that doesn't just identify the problems that we face in our society, but also talks about solutions and the people who are finding and envisioning and putting into motion those solutions. So, the recent attacks by the Trump administration on law firms is something that I'm not sure everybody understands why that's so important to pay attention to. I know a lot of people think lawyers, particularly lawyers at big fancy law firms, how are they upholding democracy, right? Wasn't it Shakespeare that said, first, let's kill all the lawyers? Well, actually, if you look at that play, Henry VI, what he's talking about is actually it's a conversation between a rebel leader and a brutal butcher. And what they're actually saying is the way that you can advance a coup is essentially to get rid of the people who are oath bound to uphold the rule of law. It actually is a great descriptor of what is happening right now. And I want to break that down in this episode. And I couldn't think of a better person to do that with than Scott Harshbarger. He is a former Attorney General of the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he is now chair of Lawyers Defending American Democracy. General Harshbarger, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's nice to be on, Kimberly. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. So first, I want you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at LDAD.
Well, I am now a senior counsel at a small firm in Boston, Kasner and Edwards. And at my, believe it or not, Kimberly, my 50th Harvard Law School reunion in 2018 gave a speech about the challenges facing American democracy, comparing them to 1968 and the Vietnam era, the civil rights, the Watergate period, in which one of the quotes that I've used a great deal actually was the W.B. Yeats quote that Ken Burns also used in his Vietnam series, which was, "Things fall apart, the center will not hold." And the reality is that today, one of the great challenges we have been facing, particularly with the Trump administration and others, has been a threat to the traditional norms and values, principles of our democracy, our Constitution, and the rule of law. That's how LDAD was begun, that we were trying to figure out lawyers, if anybody's got to defend democracy, lawyers should be leading the charge. And one of my, at the time even, one of my great concerns, I said this in my 50th class report, was that here I come from this law school, Harvard Law School, and the silence of my profession, the silence of lawyers about, at that time, even the very clear challenges to due process, to core principles. The lawyers were silent. They were not speaking out on this. And the question was, if lawyers aren't going to do this, it's sort of the John Lewis quote, if not now, when? If not us, who? And since the time of not only the Constitution, but with Alexis de Tocqueville, one of his comments in his tour of America in the early 19th century, talking not only about civil society and its key in democracy, but that lawyers were central to preserving the community, the underlying underpinnings of our democracy, of the rule of law, of the acceptance of peaceful transitions and peaceful resolution of disputes. That's where we are. And today we're facing it much more directly, I think, than in my time. And I was not around in Nazi Germany, but since we've all read about that experience, plus your Shakespeare quote, which
Yeah,
is actually just as relevant today as ever
it is.
in this area. So, Lawyers Defending American Democracy was formed to attempt on our part to mobilize lawyers to speak out, to defend democracy, to be willing to fulfill our oaths, which we take the oath as lawyers to
Yes, we do.
uphold the Constitution and laws, to preserve the rule of law, and to uphold uh, the system of law. That's the centerpiece of our democracy. And
It is.
lawyers were silent then. Lawyers today are being challenged as never before because far too many are silent. More and more, though, more and more, we're beginning to see the people are rising, and so are lawyers, finally, to sort of take on the challenge of upholding our democracy and preventing its erosion and sleepwalking into autocracy.
And Scott, on that point, you anticipated my next question, which is why, just to let our audience get a full understanding, why is the administration attacking law firms in this way? Why are they targeting them, threatening to pull their security clearances, which for a lot of these attorneys, that's basically like a professional death sentence, that they need those security clearances in order to advocate for their clients and do their jobs, and they're seeking to impose other penalties upon them if they don't capitulate. Why is this attack happening?
This attack is happening, in my view, because it is designed specifically to undermine the rule of law, the checks and balances that uphold, that are the check not only for the executive and Congress, but uphold the judiciary. These challenges to the power elite are designed to intimidate, to threaten, to cajole, to warn you that do you really want to keep doing business? Do you still want to keep making millions of dollars? Do you want to exist with us here, and or do you want to make a deal? And the fact is that this has not been very subtle. This has been exactly, to me, with all due respect to the president, whatever else his flaws are, he tells you, it's
That
like,
is true.
do you believe me or my lying eyes? And he
Mm-hmm.
he tells it. He This is deliberately targeting certain power elite law firms for two reasons. One is retribution for things that they have done either in attacking the administration in the past, lawyers who serve in that administration, or trying to get them to be in a position where they are neutralized in challenging the government at this point in time. And he's doing exactly the very clever tactic of doing it one at a time and challenging as, let's kid ourselves, a bully to and virtually extortion. It's illegal. Let's be clear. It's illegal. It's
Mm-hmm.
unconstitutional. Every court that's looked at this so far has basically said this is ridiculous. This is a shocking abuse of power. And yet it continues. That's why it's so important to remind people about it. Now, your point is a very good one. Many people, I think, sort of take some of these things for granted. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
lawyers, to say lawyers are ethical and concerned about things often is viewed as an oxymoron in our
Sure.
society. But the fact is, and it, the, it's tackling the big guys that is the important part here.
Mm.
he the assumption is if we can take on the power elite, the top 100, the top 20, if we can take
Yeah.
them individually, then we will intimidate and all the others will fall in line, and
Yeah.
that will lower any resistance to the kinds of things that we are doing. And more important, and maybe even in the short term, I'm making a point. You
Mm-hmm.
weaponized the Department of Justice, those of you in the deep state. You came after me. I'm now coming after you. And we're
Right.
going to neutralize those who defend democracy, who are standing and delivering on behalf of the Constitution and the rule of law. It's pretty
Yes.
simple.
Yeah, and at that point is so important because I think a lot, obviously, it's been reported that he began at least targeting law firms that had committed the awful sin of actually having clients that belong to the Democratic Party in the past, including clients uh, who were his political opponents at some point or another. So he's literally using the levers of the federal government to target his political opponents, which is just so antithetical to democracy. But your point is so important too. If you go after the big guys and you bring them to heel, then he thinks that he can that's the Shakespearean kill all the lawyers move right there, right?
Well, and
That's why he's doing
the
it.
best part is, Kimberly, is take them. If they'll just come at me one at a time, I'm sure to win.
Yeah.
The challenge is, this is a classic example of unity is the best resistance here. This is what we're calling for, is if lawyers united and refused to collaborate, refused to give in, and simply
Mm,
said, we are standing together because this is about the rule of law. This is about not just short term gain, but long term benefit. This is about our reputations. This is about our standing in the community. We are signaling to our clients that we will stand and provide zealous advocacy within the bounds of the law, regardless. That's how we made our money. That's what we're doing. If they will give in, if they will give in, then that's ultimately the erosion of any
yeah.
concerns. And then the less of the firms that have less stake, less powerful,
Right.
uh, succumb. But what's so
Yes.
interesting is look at the ones who are standing, and by standing tall, you have Jenner Block, Perkins Coie, Sussman, Wilmer Hale,
Hmm.
and they're the most important point here is as soon as they go to court, they win.
Yes.
Because it is so not only blatantly extortionate in one sense,
Yep.
it's also simply illegal
It
to
is.
threaten, to sort of try to interfere with the hiring, with the client decision making. It violates ethical principles. It it provides essentially it eliminates the core function of the judiciary and to be independent, to make
That's right.
decisions on the facts and the law. And it's also important because if lawyers give in, that undermines the judiciary as a viable check and balance in our system of separation of powers. And it has been the judiciary. It was in 2020, and it is today. So far, Republican or Democratic appointments, it doesn't matter. The judiciary has stood tall, at least at the lower levels, in terms of upholding the core principles of the rule of law. And
Yeah.
law
Yeah.
firms have an obligation to support the judiciary, if nothing else.
I want to note just that lawyers defending American democracy and other legal advocacy groups have called on law firms in an open letter to unite and defend themselves and defend the rule of law and stand up against these, what I agree are unlawful efforts to interfere with the way that they do their jobs. Scott, why there are some firms, there are a handful, maybe more than a handful by the time this airs, of law firms that have capitulated, that are saying that they are going to not just capitulate to the demands from the Trump administration to do all sorts of things like getting rid of DEI and basically giving the federal government a say in how they operate, and also donating hundreds of millions of dollars in pro bono services to uh, causes that they and the administration agree on, which is nuts. I mean, you don't. Nobody should dictate who your clients are, and certainly not the president of the United States. But if that's the case, if everything that we've been saying so far in this conversation, Scott, why would the Skadden Arps of the legal world capitulate?
Well, that's a question that has been being discussed and thought about greatly, and trying to be as respectful as possible. The reality is they engaged in an act of cowardice that will stain their reputation, that has threatens to stain the entire profession's reputation by capitulating. They have convinced themselves that they have not sacrificed their values or their independence. They simply wanted to get out of the firing line. But more importantly, they wanted to preserve their profits and business. Look, it's understandable. This is what has already happened. Many corporate leaders have bent the knee already. With all due respect to much of the media, in large measure, some of the media have bent the knee, obeying in advance, as Timothy Snyder refers to.
They
And
have,
in
yes.
some respects, it's a policy that sometimes works with in these kind of cases. But here are firms that have traditionally been the toughest, who hold themselves out as we are the strongest advocates for you. That's why you should come to us. We have the wisdom, we have the clout, and we're making $5 or $6 million per partner, and we don't want to lose. They don't want to lose that. And what you're seeing is the reaction that I think has been most telling to me has been far too often silently, but by and large, the profession as a whole is shocked. Shocked that this occurred. That doesn't mean that the leaders of these firms are going to concede, but they're shocked. And the second part is this is the equivalent of dealing with respect, The Godfather. This is like you're giving in to an extortionate threat. Right now, it doesn't seem so bad. Right now, okay, you can convince yourself and your associates and your partners and maybe clients and maybe the public that we didn't really sacrifice anything. He hasn't really asked us to do anything. Just don't sue him in court. Don't go in like Harvard did. Don't go in like Jenner Block and other firms are doing and sue us. Just relax. That is the equivalent, of blindness in terms of what will happen as you go down the line. The other piece of this is that I think it has finally energized many hundreds of lawyers, thousands of lawyers. The problem is there are another range of firms that are still remaining silent, trying to see how this will play out. That's why this movement, this open letter, was designed to let people know there are all kinds of lawyers out here standing and calling you out that will stand with you, that are urging you simply to unify, not sacrifice your principles, not sacrifice your independence, but stand unified, because that's how you will stop this, and then you can decide how to proceed. And that's what we're also asking the people to do, for the people to rise collectively. This is not an act, these are not actions that are standalones. The courage is contagious, being willing to stand up is, but also capitulating is contagious. And that's what, with
Yes.
respect, the president and the executive count on. Now, I want to underline, because one of the points here is it's hard to say when our criticism is of the executive branch, which happens to be controlled by President Trump, a Republican, that we are not partisan. Lawyers Defending American Democracy is a C3 nonprofit.
Yep.
We have pledged to be nonpartisan. As somebody asked me one day, well, then why is it that many of your criticisms are about what appear to be the Republican leader in this? And part of my answer is look at what's occurring. It is right now, that is where the challenge is coming. This does not mean that we're
Exactly.
freeing up, the Democrats. It's just the Democrats, for whatever reason, have no clout, do not appear to have power. And I think that the call here is, as a profession, we want people, we would like lawyers in order to preserve their independence, their integrity, their ethics, and set an example and be the example for people who don't have the privilege of being a lawyer, of being an officer of the court, of being an administrator of justice, of taking an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws. That is a unique privilege, oath, and obligation that we
It is.
have, that heretofore we have not been fulfilling.
And that's so important, Scott. Standing up and standing up in unison for these bigger firms to do is also, it also shields smaller firms who don't have the same wherewithal to, to stand up when some sort of government force comes in and says, yeah, it's a nice law firm you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. Because it really is. Like you said, it's like the Godfather. That's
Right.
exactly what they're
Well,
doing. So I want to ask you a question now. And yes, you point out correctly that LDAD is a nonpartisan organization that is about the Constitution. It's about democracy. It's about defending the rule of law, which you would hope would have, at one point, it seemed to have been a bipartisan
right.
value, but it isn't anymore. I want you to put on a different hat now. As a former state attorney general, what do you see the role of attorneys general at this moment in standing up for the rule of law? They're lawyers in a different way. They're called the people's lawyers. What role do they have here, and how do you think they've been doing?
I think their role is crucial. Of course, I am biased. I do think that state attorneys general have historically played a very significant role, often and hopefully at the best in partnership with the Department of Justice, not separate from it.
Mm.
The problem today is that the Department of Justice, in my view, is not fulfilling its overall federal responsibility. But that being said, state attorneys general have a responsibility to the people of their, in Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They are upholding state laws, state interests in this. And we are seeing, I think, a very good thing from the 21 Democratic attorneys general. But I also, when I say that, I don't mean to be like the old person saying what it used to be like. I grew up with Frank Bellotti as my mentor, a person I had never voted for, did not know, who hired people on the merit in the Attorney General's office and turned it into a powerful independent force in the public interest on behalf of people who without us had no one, and committed us to a proposition that we would make decisions on the facts and the law. The best thing that Frank always asked for, and the best thing we did in my era, particularly with things like the tobacco lawsuit and other things, was it was a bipartisan attorneys general. It was a Republican and Democratic attorneys general. In fact, in that era, and this is like the old days, you weren't a Republican or a Democratic attorney general. You were an attorney general
Right.
because it weakened you to be seen as a Democrat or Republican attorney general because your claim was you were acting in the public interest, you were making decisions on the facts and the law, not the politics of situations, and upholding your Commonwealth or state's interests was crucial. In the prior administration, far too often it was just Republican attorneys general challenging Joe Biden and Congress and that. Uh, and here, I think these attorneys general, as Andrea Campbell, as one of the leaders of these, are doing it as Maura Healey did before in the prior administration, doing exactly what I would want a state attorney general to do. I just don't want them only to focus on on the federal government, though. I want to make
Right.
sure they don't forget that you're attorney general for the Commonwealth, and there are things here that you need to focus on that aren't always as black, with respect, so clearly supported by everybody. As one of the criticisms of the attorneys general in this area is, well, you're taking the easy one. You're going at, in this case, President Trump, right? 80% of not 80%, 60% of Massachusetts people, support Democrats, support you. So that's a pretty easy political hit. What people forget about, I think, in that regard is that it's also, though, the right thing to do. That is, the mere fact it's
Mm.
politically good is often a good thing. But here, standing up for consumer protection, for civil rights, standing up for the independence of universities, standing up for the independence for upholding due process, of supporting the state and federal courts,
Yep.
not giving in to ICE exercising violation of of state law, not just federal law. So I think they're doing exactly the right thing. I think the challenge for us as lawyers, as a profession, is how do we this cannot be seen as simply a democratic legal profession. This is a legal profession. We are not partisan in that regard, and that's why I know there are people of a different party in many law firms who agree fully. And Lawyers Defending American Democracy has many, many supporters that are,
Sure.
if we ask them, are Republican or Democrat, because they're supporting the effort because it is about the rule of law. And as I said in my class report at the time, and they're saying this is nonpartisan in my view, unless you believe that due process, equal protection, the rule of law, the core principles of democracy are partisan.
Right.
If you do, I can't help you about that. But the
Right.
reality is I see that as the core of our democracy, the core of our community, and it is what holds us together as a nation and actually separates us historically from almost every other civilization. We are about to blow that if we don't, as lawyers. I mean, that's really what's at stake. If the legal profession does not stand up here,
Yeah.
we risk sacrificing the core central elements of our democracy, of our
Yep.
Constitution, and of our community.
These points are so important, Scott, because I mean, when I practiced law, I didn't think about the party that I belong to at all. I thought about what the law said. I thought about what the Constitution said. I thought about the interest of my clients, and I
Right.
acted out in that way. And I took and still take very seriously the fact that I was and still am, I still consider myself a lawyer, even though I'm not actively practicing. Um, it's one of the few professions that is not a public office where you take an oath. You take an oath to uphold the Constitution of your state and the United States. In order to even practice, you have to stand with your hand raised and do that. You have to say those words, and they meant something to me. I still remember standing in Faneuil Hall and having goosebumps as I took my oath when I was sworn into the bar. And I just want every attorney to remember that moment, to remember the moment that they raised their hands
Think about
and
it,
they vowed it. And
Kimberly.
they vowed to, yeah,
You're so right. And think about this. How do you teach ethics to the next generation of law students
mhm,
in this country without focusing on the privilege and the standards and principles that we're talking about? How do
yeah,
you tell them you can go? Again, I guess the answer here is pretty simple. Are you picking profits and salary and compensation over professional achievement and satisfaction? And that is one of the great challenges here. We have become, as a profession, far too geared to the profitability side of the equation. Now, much of these cases, you're right, you can handle clients that it's not a problem to be very successful. What
mhm,
is a problem is if it dictates how you will uphold or not uphold your oath to help the underpinnings of the system. The system is what has made you wealthy. The
yeah,
system, because it can be trusted, because it is preserves the ethics of the profession, because it is independent, because it does stand up against challenges to its independence, is the key to success in the legal profession. And when major firms, I think this is the concern that we're expressing, if major firms decide that their own interest must stand above the public, broader professional interest, we have a problem. And step by step, that will erode confidence in the profession, confidence in the judiciary, confidence in the rule of law, and any sense of the checks and balances. And that erodes the central structure, the strongholds of our democracy, which are the institutions, the constraints that keep us free. And that's what I think this is all about. I think these firms, I'm very hopeful that more and more as lawyers see what is occurring, you're beginning to see the tide change. I also hope and believe that we as citizens, you ask about who has an obligation here. John Gardner used to talk about, or Jimmy Carter even resigned from the presidency to take what he thought was the most important office in a democracy, the office of citizen. The
Mm,
John Gardner line was, this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not for the moneyed, not for the wealthy, not for anybody else. And I think this is why we as a people need to also rise. But lawyers have a special obligation. We can't duck out of this by saying that we claim to be special. We have chosen to be special. We claim the privilege, and now comes the time the chits are in. Will that privilege stand? Will be willing, frankly, to uphold the tradition, the legacy, and more importantly, the deep personal and professional centrality of the rule of law in our democracy. If it's not, we are on the road. And one can argue that we are very much closer to autocracy and moving
yes,
in that direction than we ever expected to be. And
yes,
we should not have been asleep at the switch, which too many of us were
yeah.
at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree. Autocracy is at the door and it is knocking. I am so grateful that you joined me today, Scott Harshbarger, the former Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and now the chair of Lawyers Defending American Democracy, and someone who I have been learning from for decades, ever since the days decades ago when I was a cub reporter at the Boston Herald covering politics. So it's good to
Wow.
see you. And I really appreciate you joining Justice by Design today, Scott.
Well, I am honored to be here. As I've said to you on other occasions, I am very pleased that you have adopted the view that talking about the law, talking about your experience as a member of the media is so important and is a central element because we do have an education problem in the
Mm,
country about what people understand and think about. And I think that the podcast, the columns, while you may feel that they're frustrating and nobody, the reality is that this again is an area where a few people begin to do it. More and more people now are beginning to write about it, think about it, and understand that we face a very critical decision point in this country. And uh, I do believe with John Meacham that the better angels may well prevail, but I also understand uh, that we also need to understand that this is a moment in which we are being challenged in a way that Abraham Lincoln talked about,
mm,
in the Civil War, which is,
yeah.
this is a question whether this nation, conceived and dedicated to liberty, can it withstand these kind of challenges? And we are in the middle of that right now. And I am hopeful that we will prevail, that the people will rise.
Yes. Well, thank you, Scott. And thanks to everyone for listening to this week's episode of Justice by Design. Don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you listen and give me 5 stars too, because that helps other people join this important conversation. I'll be back next week with another episode. I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr.